thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Jyotish Kovid, and I will just, before I introduce Shayn, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome to a presentation by the Caritas Consciousness Project. And we are a nonprofit organization that offers a lot of different kinds of events, including lectures such as this evening, and workshops and study groups and classes, etc., all designed to promote the evolution of consciousness in many different ways. So that's who we are, and I welcome you all and thank you for attending. And now I'm going to introduce our speaker, who is Shayn Smith. He offers over 45 years experience as an astrologer. During the 1970s, he hosted and guested on astrological radio shows in Buffalo, New York. Currently, Shayn practices Vedic and Western astrology in Boulder, Colorado. He studied with the late Professor V.K. Choudhry of Gurgaon. I don't know how to say that.
Gurgaon, yeah.
Gurgaon, India. Propounder of Systems Approach to Vedic Astrology. He was conferred the honorary titles of Jyotish Kovid, interesting name for today.
No.
No relation to the virus,
No.
which means learned astrologer, and Jyotish Visharad, which means experienced astrologer, from the Systems Institute of Hindu Astrology in India. Shayn serves as a faculty member of the International Institute of Predictive Astrology and is president of the IIPA Colorado chapter. He teaches Vedic and Western astrology classes through the Boulder Lifelong Learning Program, and I think he has a class coming up. Shayn has a Ph.D. in counseling psychology, which helps a lot when you're an astrologer, and has taught at several colleges. He's past president of the Colorado Counseling Association. Please welcome our speaker, Shayn Smith. And Shayn, please take the mic.
Well, thank you very much, Gloria, for that introduction, wonderful introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here tonight to maybe shed some light on what this year has been all about. I'm sure you're all curious as to, what up there has been going on to produce such pandemonium, as it says on the slide here. And you can all see the slide, I'm sure. And I hope to shed some light on, perhaps when we might escape this trial that we've been going through, and indeed it's been a trial for all of us. And my heartfelt prayers and wishes are with you all for whatever you may have experienced for yourself and your family and loved ones. And let's hope that we can all get through this together. So. I'm going to talk a little bit about my background. Gloria, I know, did a wonderful job with that, but it was in the early 1970s. I can remember where actually, if any of you are astrologers, you might know what I'm talking about, and if you're not, that's okay. I'll try to explain it. I'll need to do some jargon, talk a little bit, but I'll try to minimize that as much as possible, because I know that some of you may not be familiar with astrology talk, and I don't want to, kind of bore you to tears with all of that. However,
Shayn,
yes.
I forgot, and you forgot. We wanted to, Shayn would prefer that questions be held to the end. Okay.
Oh, right.
Now,
yeah.
if you are desperate if you have a question and you don't want to forget it, you can type it in at the bottom of the screen. You can see a chat box, and you can type it in there. so that you don't forget the question, and then we'll read them at the end.
Oh, thank you. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot of information for me to go through. So, yeah, if you could save your questions till the end, as Gloria mentioned, that would be wonderful. It's good to see some folks on the call that I know, and I'll be referring to you as we go along, because it was at your instigation that this all came up for me. But anyway, back in the early 70s, I recall, as Pluto was crossing over my ascendant. Pluto is the planet of transformation, by the way, and we're gonna revisit Pluto throughout this talk, because Pluto plays a big role in what's happening in the skies today. But as Pluto was transiting over my ascendant, I was undergoing some huge transformational changes. I was a student at the University of Colorado. University at Buffalo. And I remember going over to a friend's house for a social gathering, and there was a box of books that they were giving away. And I looked through it, and I saw one on astrology. And I think it was Linda Goodman's Sun Sign. And for those of us who, might have cut our teeth on astrology way back when, that was the book, And so for me, it kind of launched me on my journey into astrology. Of course, at that time, I was also delving into theosophy, and I was a member of the Astara Mystery School, and taking religion and Buddhism and Hinduism classes at the University of Buffalo. So really getting into, another world, so to speak. And that's what Pluto does. It basically tips your world upside down and makes you see something very different. So that's kind of a short introduction to how I became interested in astrology. And of course, I wanted to know more about myself and who I am and what I'm here for and so forth. And I think I've come to a realization of what that is, and that is to embrace everyone with mind and heart. I look at my mission in life, and to cut it to the quick, that's what it is. So I'm going to move ahead here with the slides. And here's a chart of today. And I won't, mention too much other than to say that there's some challenging aspects going on in this chart. We had a new moon about 1:30 this afternoon. And that new moon launches us into another month of stuff, and we'll talk about what that stuff is. But you'll notice that that new moon is in a challenging relationship to some of the heavy hitters that we're going to be talking about pretty soon. So hang on, just what they say, buckle up your seatbelts. You make sure your seatbelts are on and your trays are in their up lock and locked position, so upright and locked positions. And I'm also going to be talking about the Vedic perspective. So I'm going to be bilingual tonight and talk about Western astrology and Jyotish, which is what they call in India the science of light. And here's what a Jyotish chart looks like. This is North Indian style. My teacher I'd like to acknowledge from my studies with Jyotish back beginning in 2005 is Professor V.K. Choudhry, as Gloria mentioned. Here is a picture of us during my visit to India back in 2006. And he taught me his systems approach to Vedic astrology, and he's from Gurgaon, India, and which is a little outside of Delhi. And Gurgaon means, well, if you look at the first three letters, Gur, And you know that it's Sanskrit for guru, which is teacher. And so he explained to me that, back in the early days, students would come to learn from their teachers in this town or city. And that's exactly what I did. When I went out in 2006, I attended a Vedic Astrology conference there. It was the first international Institute of Predictive Astrology put on by the Systems Institute of Hindu Astrology. My teacher made a prediction back in 2015 in October. And this is when we had 15 Republican candidates running, Donald Trump being one of them. His prediction at that time was he has a fairly good chance of political success in becoming president. Now, you may recall that there were a lot of astrologers who put forth their particular opinions on the elections of 2016, many of them pinning their hopes on Hillary Clinton. Professor Choudhry was one of the few astrologers who predicted a victory for Donald Trump. And looking at this chart, I'll just explain what my teacher was looking at. He was looking at the fact that Donald Trump had, in November of 2016, when he would have taken office, he had a very strong new Mahadasha and sub-period ruler, and that was the strong Jupiter in his chart. So if you look at this chart here, you'll see Jupiter in green. The R next to it means that it was retrograde at the time of his birth. But in Donald Trump's chart, Jupiter is very, very strong and rules the fifth house of wisdom and intelligence and emotional intelligence and professional development. And it's in his second house of status. So he definitely nailed that one, in my opinion. And unfortunately, my teacher passed several years ago, so he's no longer able to predict the next presidential cycle, but I will do my best to make that a possibility in this presentation. So here it is, 2020, the Planetary Pandemonium, and I'll cover the planets that are affecting us to make the world it is what it is in 2020. I'll talk about something that is very little known in astrology circles. It's called geodetic maps. I'll talk about eclipses, of course, everybody knows about those, and the galactic center plays a role in all of this. We'll talk about the social economic unrest and the elections coming up, including the chart's predictions and the 20-year cycle that some people may or may not know about, which is pretty interesting. So hang on, here we go for the ride. You ready? So I belong to a group of pranic healers. And what we do is we help folks overcome all sorts of emotional, physical conditions through the ancient art of healing, energy healing. And they asked me to come and share with them in 2019 my forward look at the year 2020. And at the time, I said, well, it looks like old structures and traditions are going to be shaken down and transformed. And I know that there are several healers on the call tonight who were there at that meeting, and you'll probably remember that. So, what are we talking about? We were talking about, I had no idea that it would include all of these things and more. The impeachment trial and the acquittal in January, Brexit. I'll even throw in Harry and Meghan. You know, of course, they abandoned their royal duties, which is an abandonment of tradition, right? The U.S. abandons who? Of course, we all know about the COVID-19 pandemic and the isolations and the quarantines, the lockdowns, the shutdowns, the product rebranding. Some products have, what was it? Aunt Jemima for, pancakes and so forth. Some of those things happened. Economic downturns, travel restrictions, of course, couldn't go anywhere. In fact, my wife and I were to go on a cruise, and of course that was canceled. Police shootings and brutality, protests and riots, worldwide wars still going on, wildfires, and of course the wild U.S. election. So a lot of stuff and more, has taken place. And you might look at 2020 and go, whoa, did we ever see that happen? And I couldn't even predict way back then in December of 2019 that all that stuff would happen. All I knew was, I had a couple of planets in mind and they were doing certain things, and I said, yeah, this is what's going to happen. But boy, did it happen. So we've developed new normals and opportunities as a result. Social distancing, wearing masks. I just went into the bank today wearing a mask. Who would have thought a year ago that you could do that and get away with it? Increased sanitization, working from home, of course, teleconferencing, telemedicine, everything, including this presentation, takeout, curbside service, home delivery, and more. We've developed a new kind of way of living as a result of 2020, haven't we? I'm going to just take a kind of a brief little detour for a moment here and talk about March 19th, 2020. Where were you on that day? And it's kind of interesting for me to kind of look at this. In March, we kind of, as the United States of America, realized that we were in some deep doo-doo. And regarding the COVID situation. And California was the first state to issue a stay-at-home order mandating all residents stay at home except to go on essential jobs or shop for essential needs. And so, that kind of, propelled us through the year, and other states followed suit, Colorado included, of course. So here is the chart for March 19th. And regardless of whether you know astrology or not, let me explain a little bit about what we're seeing. What we're seeing is, of course, around March 19th, March 20th, we know that we enter the solstice. And that's when the sun enters Aries. And that's what we call spring. So it's the spring equinox. They're equal days, equal nights. And so I don't know if you can see my mouse cursor, but it's pointing to the sun. And here it is at 29 degrees Pisces, 41 minutes. And so it's about 19 degrees away from entering into the sign of Aries. And so when it does that, we say, okay, Aries is the beginning of the year of the zodiac, and so here we go. We've got spring on our hands. But there are other things happening here, which I think you're going to find interesting. When I put up the next slide, you'll see what I'm talking about. When the moon is in the 7th house and Jupiter aligns with Mars. Yes, we were in the dawning of the age of Aquarius on March 19th, 2020. So you may say, oh my goodness, where is peace and understanding and love and all that stuff? It was about the farthest thing from that. Well, maybe, something like a pandemic forces us to look in that direction. And that's, my hope is sometimes that we encounter these difficult situations so that we can focus on what is really real. And what is really real is, our fellow human being and how we embrace them, support them, love them, help them in any way we can. So was this the dawning of the age of Aquarius? Not quite. We've got another 400 years to go until actually we are in the age of Aquarius. So maybe in the long cycle of 26,000 years, which is what the cycle is, we will, 400 years out of 26,000, yeah, I guess you can call that the dawning of the age of Aquarius. But, definitely, we've got a little ways to go, but hopefully what situations like these do is bring us together in times of need so that we are more considerate and respectful and helpful of one another. And that's my hope for everybody. All right, here are the elephants in the room: Saturn and Pluto. Okay, so I mentioned old structures and traditions, which is represented by the planet Saturn, are shaken down and transformed by Pluto. And that's what I was talking to the healers about back in December of 2019 when I was asked to give the talk. Saturn has a cycle of 29 and a half years around the zodiac. Pluto is about 248. And every 32 to 38 years, they align. That's what they're doing right now in Capricorn, in both the Eastern and the Western zodiacs. The last time they did this was about 1982. And in that year, the Times Man of the Year was the computer. Now, that is a traditional break, because up until that time, it's always been a person, and now it's the computer. And now we realize that, computers play an important role in our lives. But it was also the death of USSR's Brezhnev. And there were several leadership changes after that death that eventually came to Mikhail Gorbachev, who then, really helped to kind of bring the USSR back into a modern age. There was also a new constitution in China which reformed social and economic changes. And so, yeah, I mean, there were some big changes back then in those days, in 1982. And, you can go back and look at other years prior to 1982 when Saturn and Pluto were aligned, and you can look at some of the upheavals or changes, the huge changes that those two outer planets made. And I refer to Pluto as an outer planet because I think, and many astrologers and many people still think, that it is part of the Brotherhood of Planets, despite what the Astronomical Society says. It may be demoted, but it's not out. Pluto packs a huge wallop, and we've seen that already. I'm going to talk about something called the geodetic map. This is something we use in astrology. And what it does is it overlays the signs of the zodiac upon the Earth. And it starts with Greenwich Mean Time. So if you look over here to where it says 0, and it's got the ram's horn, that's Aries, there's the midheaven going through Greenwich Mean Time, and then you proceed eastward and you go into Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, and all the subsequent signs of the zodiac. Those are your midheavens. So it assumes that the midheaven of these places are all locked in place. Also, you'll notice these yellow lines going around, and the yellow lines represent the ascendant. The ascendant and the midheaven are two very important angles that astrologers use. The ascendant represents basically the personality, who you are, how you're perceived, how you look at the world. The midheaven represents your social standing and how you are perceived by the outer world, and your rise to fame and fortune and so forth. And so this geodetic map, um, um, Chris McRae is an astrologer in, I think, Edmonton, Canada. She uses the geodetic map a lot, but she also credits, I think, the development of this map to Safarial back in the 1920s. And so it's interesting to see that, actually you can look at the world like the horoscope of the world right here, with this outline. And so I'm going to show you something very interesting right now. At the beginning of January 2020, on this geodetic map, if we were to place the transiting planets of Saturn and Pluto, you'll see that they cross through China near a place called Wuhan. And Wuhan is, of course, we know, the origination of the COVID-19 virus. So I thought, whoa, that's incredible. And at that time in January, they were about 1 degree apart. Notice how close they are together. Now, in a geodetic map, as well as any astrocartography map. And the geodetic map is like an astrocartography map, only it's a little different because they use these kind of inlaid signs that are fixed. In a astrocartography map, if you ever had one done for you, it involves looking at the planets according to your chart, as if you were born in a particular place and you have the angles drawn for that particular place in the chart. I remember when astrocartography maps came out back in the 70s, I immediately jumped on it because I thought, well, this is interesting. I've got the whole world at my command. Where would I best find myself? And I remembered getting the map back from Jim Lewis, who was the developer and creator of the astrocartography map. And back in those days, they numbered what number order you were, and I was like 169. So I was one of the first 200 people to get an astrocartography map, and it was really, really interesting. And that's what brought me out here to Boulder, Colorado, by the way. But back to the geodetic map, you'll also notice that the same two, and I'm going to point down here, to Saturn and Pluto are crossing through Europe. And the influence is pretty wide. It's like it spans from Spain into England and France, and especially Italy was very hard hit early on in the COVID-19 experience. And you can see how close these lines were to Italy. Now, in the United States, wow, look at this. I've circled the Pluto and Saturn lines off the coast of Washington, D.C. And Washington, D.C., I'm sorry, Washington State. Washington State was had the first confirmed case relating to COVID-19 back in January 21st, 2020. And then until mid-March, it was kind of like the place for COVID activity until New York City took over as kind of like the epicenter of all of those. So you see Saturn and Pluto here off the coast of New York City, and there you have it. You have the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, kind of like bookending the United States of America. And for those who follow astrology know that that's not the end of the story, but when you have Saturn and Pluto together, you also have what they call midpoints. And if you go midway between Saturn and Pluto conjunction, you're like in the heartland of the Americas. And so everything in between is going to also be affected. So basically, that shows how we have been pretty much affected by this Saturn-Pluto conjunction. That was January 1st, 2020. Here's today. They've separated a little bit. You can see there's a little more space between Pluto and Saturn. There's about 3 degrees now versus 1 degree. And I'm going to show you when we might expect some relief when this kind of dissipates. But we're still experiencing it, and there's some other factors that come into play, and I'll talk about those. So, interesting, like, looking at a map and seeing how these planets are really impacting us all over the world. Now I'm going to talk about eclipses. We all know the impact of eclipses. Eclipses are like really powerful. They're the exact alignment of the sun and the moon and the earth, and they correlate with large-scale changes and challenges. The lunar nodes are actually mathematical points. They're called in Jyotish, or Vedic Astrology, they're called Rahu and Ketu, the north node and the south node. So they're not really planets. You can't look up there in the sky tonight and see them. So they're called shadow or physical planets. And they're where the moon's orbit around the Earth crosses the sun's ecliptic plane. And so whenever they're involved, there's going to be some world scale, wide scale changes, transformations. In fact, if you read the Indian Puranas from India, they talk about the myth of Rahu and Ketu. Back way before the creation of time, the gods, or the demigods, actually they weren't quite gods yet, they weren't immortal, but they wanted to be immortal, so they were churning the ocean of milk. And that nectar they were calling Amrita, and that would give them immortality. And so the sun and the moon and all the other planets were lined up, ready to take this nectar of immortality. And along comes the serpent. And the serpent says, I'm going to slip in the line and I'm going to be immortal too. And what happens is the sun and the moon saw this happening, and they called the serpent out. And Vishnu heard about that, and with his discus he threw it, and he cut the serpent in two from the head to the body. But not until the serpent had swallowed the nectar of immortality. And so the north node, or Rahu, now is up in the sky, and Ketu, the body of the serpent, is now in the sky. And to get revenge for the moon and the sun calling them out, they said, all right, we're going to cause eclipses every so now and then, and we're going to make it a little painful for people. And so that's how we get this idea of eclipses, because of that. So here's a Vedic chart, and the Vedic chart is showing the eclipse back in 2019 of December. Actually, it was on Christmas Day here in Boulder, Colorado. And what you see here is Rahu, R-A, opposite Ketu, you see K-E. So there's the eclipse nodes of the moon. And there you see the sun and the moon conjunct together. And the sun and the moon, so this would be a solar eclipse. But look at the planet that's right in between. There's Jupiter. So that means Jupiter is going to suffer on account of this kind of like curse from a long, long time ago from the lunar nodes. And so what does Jupiter mean, and what does that portend? Now, they say that eclipses last for up to 6 months until the next eclipse. And so we're going to see that the influence of this eclipse on Jupiter is going to affect the following things, because we know that Jupiter revolves around the zodiac every 12 years, but it is in Sanskrit called Guru, the remover of darkness, the teacher, the morality. It is divine grace. It is Dharma. It is pure consciousness, truth, and it's our spiritual path. It is also representative in our bodies of the liver. So it represents the flow and the chi and the blood and the hips and anger, which is the emotion that comes out of liver. And it represents finances, wealth, long distance travel, higher education, religion. All of these things we've seen have been affected by this eclipse. Wow. So Jupiter happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, I'm going to go back for a second because I want to also point out, see this circle around 3 and the circle around 9. 3 represents the third zodiacal sign in the zodiac, which is Gemini. 9 represents the 9th zodiacal sign in the zodiac, which represents Sagittarius. So we know that these signs, because of the planets being affected within them, are also going to be affected. So what do these signs, Gemini and Sagittarius, mean? Sagittarius rules justice, truth, philosophy, good fortune, liver, gallbladder, hips, thighs, the arterial system. Justice, I underline that because we've had a lot of talk lately about justice. The injustice to racial groups in the United States. We've talked about justices on the Supreme Court, and of course the unfortunate passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Gemini, communication, media, transportation, travel, mind, all of these things have been affected by that eclipse, haven't they? I mean, I don't need to go into any more detail about that. Gemini rules the ears, the lower neck, shoulders, arms, hands, respiratory and nervous systems, bronchial tubes. All these things have been seen as affected by this particular event. The next eclipse that happened was on the solstice of June 21st. And here we have Ketu, Rahu, Sun and Moon. Again, you need those 4 players to make an eclipse. And we also have something called GC. And I'll get to that in just a moment. But let's first note that, again, we see the signs of Gemini, the third sign of the zodiac, and Sagittarius, the 9th sign of the zodiac, affected here. GC stands for the galactic center. What is the galactic center? Well, it's the rotational center of the Milky Way. It's a huge black hole, scientists have discovered now, around which the solar system revolves. And in the sidereal zodiac, which is the zodiac practiced by Jyotish or Vedic Astrology, it's 3 degrees. Let's go back. There's 3 degrees. It's pretty darn close to 458. It's within 2 degrees. So we're going to see a huge impact on the galactic center. So what does that mean? Well, according to Dr. David Frawley, who's a Vedic scholar and teacher, the galactic center is an important point of karmic rectification in Vedic astrology. The next few decades, and I think he wrote this 10, maybe 20 years ago, the next few decades are bound to cause an increasing karmic reorientation in humanity, with more difficult economic, ecological, and political problems on one hand, and a search for deeper spirituality and planetary responsibility on the other. So whenever you do have a problem, usually, something that kind of sends you to your knees in prayer, you do find yourself looking upward or looking outward or looking towards some sort of solution in the universe. You can call it whatever you want, whatever resonates with your particular orientation, but brings us to our spirituality in many cases. And this is what's happening here. Our next eclipse is going to be on December 14th, 2020. And on that day, we're going to see K2 and the sun and the moon, the usual players with Rahu. But there's another planet in there. It's squeezed in the middle like a pea and butter and jelly sandwich. It's called Mercury. Whew. Okay. So for the next 6 months after that eclipse, Mercury's significations are going to come to the fore. What does that mean? Mercury transits the zodiac in about 1 year. It rules transportation, travel, communication, learning, media, reasoning, also the lungs, respiratory system, skin, nervous system, lower abdomen. So some of these things, a couple of these things you're going to find are going to be in the news and will be affecting our lives after that eclipse. So be prepared. That's all I've got to say. Be prepared. And the signs that they took place in, I'm going to point those out. 8 is Scorpio. It's the 8th sign of the zodiac. The 2nd sign of the zodiac is Taurus. And so, and again, I'm talking about this in the sidereal or the Vedic Astrology zodiac system. There's a difference between the two of about 24 degrees, by the way. And it's all because of the precession of the equinoxes. When we measure in the Western astrology system, we measure the zodiac as starting at the point of the spring or vernal equinox, March 20th. And at that point we say, okay, the sun is at 0 degrees Aries. But if you look at the star system behind the sun on that particular day, you're going to actually see that there is the constellation Pisces behind it. And so there is going to be a 24-degree difference between the Western astrology zodiac and the Eastern astrology zodiac. And so sometimes what's going to happen here is you're going to say, well, wait a minute, you know, that's not right. But according to whatever sign we're talking about, it's going to be right. So what does Scorpio Taurus mean? Well, Scorpio is intense, deep, powerful, transformative, passionate, secret, and Taurus is comfort, beauty, luxury, material, finances. So we know that there's something going to happen after December of this year that's going to be deep, powerful in its relationship to these things that we're talking about of comfort, beauty, and luxury, material. And I'll kind of leave that up to you to kind of spin it around in your mind as to what that could mean. I mean, I could spin off a whole bunch of things, but I think you get the idea. Finances? Yeah. Oh, we're going to be doing business very differently next year than we are now. So now I'm going to shift focus a little bit to the United States chart. And the United States chart helps us to look at what's happening within the United States of America. There are a lot of astrologers who use all different kinds of charts. Many of them use the Declaration of Independence, which is, as we know, July 4th, 1776. Then there's a group that I know of that uses the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, which was ratified back in 1781. That particular constitution basically was ditched because it was weak. It gave a lot of power to the states and not much to the government, central government of the United States. And so in September of 1787, there was a signing of a new U.S. Constitution, which is the one we enjoy today. And there are astrologers who use this particular chart. But I'm using the one that came 9 months later. That's when, in June 21st of 1788, New Hampshire became the 9th and last necessary state out of 13 to ratify the new U.S. Constitution. It happened to be on the solstice, June 21st, happened to be 9 months later, like it gave birth and out it came. And I've been finding that this particular chart seems to track well with some of the major events in United States history. So bear with me while we talk about this particular chart in relationship to some of the events we're talking about. Here it is. If you're a Western astrologer, June 21st, 1:07 p.m. And there is documentation that shows that around 1 o'clock or so, the folks in Concord, New Hampshire, said, all right, we're going to ratify this Constitution. And so I rectified it, which is the astrologer's way of kind of moving the chart so that it fits the events of history. And so here we go. We have the U.S. Constitution. And interestingly, if you look at this, you'll see that we've got Neptune in the first house. It's that trident symbol right here. And that represents our dreams and our aspirations. But it can also lead us astray. So anyway, let's move on. What's going on right now? In here, I've got what we call a bi-wheel. And on the inside is the U.S. constitutional chart drawn up in 1788, as we just looked at, just the screen previous. And in the outer ring are the transits for 5:30 when we started this presentation. I think one of the biggest things that is hurting us right now in the United States is this Pluto opposition Mercury. Pluto, we've talked about that before. Pluto is that transformative, I'm going to make you change whether you like it or not kind of planet. And Mercury, which is all about communication, all about media, and all about disease. Because, well, actually Pluto's about disease. Mercury is about the lungs and the respiratory system. Oh gosh. And look how close they are, 2231 to 2232 right now. No wonder we seem to be re-experiencing the epidemic right now. I mean, it seems like COVID-19, at least in the United States, is kind of conflagration. It's flaring up again. And there are some places that are saying, oh, we got to lock in restrictions back in place because letting us free just isn't working out. So here we go. When do we expect relief? Well, if we look at this Pluto Mercury conjunction, we see that actually in a couple days it's going to reach a peak on the 18th. These are the days that when you see 5, 19, and 18, you see the peaks of when this really kind of like struck. And although, we might consider March, April, May as a peak, actually it intensified there because I don't know if you noticed this little green line in April and then this red line under May. But the green line represents that Pluto was going in direct motion, and then the red line represents it's going in retrograde motion. And whenever a planet goes in retrograde motion, it kind of like it never goes backwards in reality. We all know that. But from our perception from the Earth, it does. And what happens is that slowing down increases the energy of that planet on inhabitants of the Earth. And we feel it. We feel that. And especially Pluto, which is the outermost planet, it just kind of like bears down on us. And so we're going to feel that. So we've been feeling a lot of stuff with Saturn slowed down in earlier this year. It just started up again. Jupiter, the same thing. Now Mars is in retrograde motion, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. And so Mercury retrograde, of course, we all know about Mercury retrograde. And I think the issue with Mercury, a lot of people kind of get on the bandwagon with that when that goes retrograde. I think what we react to more than anything with Mercury, at least, or with any of these planets, is when they slow down. If they slow over a sensitive point in the chart, then that point is going to be felt. That point is going to pick up that, like, it's like sandpaper sometimes over a wound. It just feels like, oh man, when's this going to end? And so that's what's happening when Pluto goes retrograde and forward and retrograde, you know. So, you know, earlier this month, I think it went, the first week it went direct again, and it's going right over that same point of Mercury. That's why it feels so intense right now. But as the months go on, and here I put 2021, you'll see that Mercury over, or Pluto over Mercury is going to dissipate. And then it might drop out of the scene for a while, but then it comes back. But since it doesn't culminate, we don't see dates here, right? So it's not going to culminate. So it's going to feel like it, but it's not really going to be like it is right now or back in September. It's going to feel kind of like something, and it might be something entirely different. So we can't really let our guard up. And we go into 2022, and then it pretty much disappears. So I think, you know, it's not over until it's over, as they say. We might have a little relief, you know, after March. And I'm going to show something else that might put a little bit more definity on that. But I'd also like to show Saturn opposite Mercury. Remember, Saturn and Pluto were together transiting. And as it transited with Pluto, it transited over Mercury. So both of them together, and you can see that kind of like kicked off the fire called COVID right here in the beginning of January. It just like lit a match and away it went. But then Saturn kind of dropped out. It kind of came back. It's kind of like there right now, but it's not really, and it's going to drop out. I just heard today that Pfizer has a pharmaceutical drug for immunization that might be, you know, out end of November, something like that. It's not going to be out before the elections, but you know, maybe that might help. I don't know. So it's going to be Pluto and Mercury kind of like hanging on with that until next year. But do be careful after that point. Okay, so there's natal Mercury. So it's going to affect transportation because Mercury is transportation and communication. We've seen all sorts of weird communication stuff going on in the United States. Posed by Saturn, restriction, Pluto, deep transformational change. So I'm going to take a look now at the U.S. constitutional chart as seen by Vedic Astrology. And here we use a system of prediction called the Mahadasha system, which means great periods of time. And so right now we are in Sun Rahu Mahadasha. It began October 6th. Before that was Mars. Before that was Moon. I'm looking at the sub-period. So there's a main period, which is on the left side of the slash. There is a sub-period, which is on the second part of the slash here. And so Rahu is on the second part of the slash of the period, subperiod, or the bhukti, as they say, that we're currently in. That began October 6th. And so, yeah, things are going to intensify because Rahu's nature is to intensify things. Rahu is that north node of the moon that we talked about. And of course, it's going to be, really in forefront and center until August of next year, when Jupiter takes over as the subperiod. We might see some relief in August of next year. But then after that, there's Saturn. But I don't want to get too far ahead of us. But, so maybe, the first part of the year up until August, we'll just have to kind of bear with it a little bit more, but there might be some relief after that. That's, a best estimate at this point. And as everything like, weather forecasting or whatever you want to, astrology is a model. We're just using models. And, when we talk about the quantum field, we're talking about all sorts of possibilities that can be changed. Well, we had some social unrest definitely during this year. And I don't need to recount them all, but, certainly that's made us uncomfortable. And when we're uncomfortable as a nation, our finances are uncomfortable. So they're linked together. And remember, we talked about Jupiter as representing also finances. So when we've had an eclipse of Jupiter, that's going to kind of stay with us for a while. But enter Mars. Mars is going wild on us right now. If we look at the U.S. Constitution ratified chart, we see that we're in a Sun-Mars period. That began May 31st of 2020. And that goes until October, which now we've already entered. And now we're in a Rahu period, as I've just mentioned. But when all the social unrest unfolded, it was during the Sun-Mars period. I think it was around the 26th of May when the riots started after the killing of George Floyd. And if you look down here, you'll see on the right-hand side, these are the transits. In other words, the planets keep moving around long after the Constitution was born back in 1788, and they move around at different speeds. Mars here is in the sixth house, which is the house that they call it in Vedic astrology, Dustan house. And a Dustan house means basically a challenging house. You got the sixth house, the eighth house, and the 12th house are challenging houses in Vedic astrology. And Mars being there means that there's going to be some strife, because one of the things the sixth house represents is disputes. And so it got kicked off by a Rahu-Mercury aspect on May 27th. And the social unrest kind of rolled right on after that. Mars picked it up with Saturn, with the Sun, with Rahu, with Saturn again in a different way, with Sun, with Mercury, with Jupiter, etc., etc. That's why we had those unrest periods, because Mars just shook everything up. Mars rules the eighth house of obstacles, delays, and all sorts of calamity. And we definitely had that. So now what's happening in the stars, and this again is Vedic astrology. We have Mars retrograde, RX means retrograde, September 10th through November 13th. And what's going to happen is we have Rahu and Ketu with Mars, which relates to stubborn behavior, anger, headstrong nature, fires. We've had fires, definitely. I mean, the Cameron Peaks fire now has been rated as the largest fire in Colorado recently. Violent accidents, bloodshed, injuries. And also I predict that the weather will be hot and dry. When you get basically, we've got the K2 and Mars are both dry planets. And I'll refer to K2 even though it's a point, not a planet. I'll refer to it as a planet, but they're both hot and dry. And you can see, actually, when it says Mars sextile Rahu here, that actually means Mars is trine K2. This program doesn't show that, but anyway, we've got some dry weather and hot weather coming up, I think, through the end of the year. So I don't think, there might be some snow in November, but, But anyway, not only the weather, but just our temperaments. Just the way things are in the United States is going to be a little bit hot under the collar. So just be prepared. So now I'll get to the elections. And it's kind of like I'm putting myself out on a limb here when I talk about this. Because what I'm doing is I'm using two kind of exploratory charts. I'm using the Constitution of the United States ratified chart, and I'm using charts of people that are running for president, namely Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Donald Trump, it's assumed that he was born at 10:54 a.m., but there are people who say that's fabricated. And so I've seen astrologers try to rectify his chart to make it fit. So we don't know if that chart is true, but it worked for my teacher way back when Donald was running with 15 other Republican candidates. So I'm sticking with that. Joe Biden's chart, we don't know the time for, but I did a rectification, which means I tried to, not manipulate, but try to, fit the times to work with events in his life. And he's had some tragedies. His wife and his daughter died in a car accident way back when, and he had brain surgery, and his one son died recently, and so there's some things that have gone on in his chart. And so rectification means we try to make it so that we can come up with a reasonable time to explain the results. So I'm going to be working with some unknowns, and if there are any errors, I am totally and fully to blame. Okay, there are just I just take full responsibility for anything here. So let's go. Let's talk about the election day itself. November 3rd, and I just kind of arbitrarily picked 10 p.m. Washington, D.C. If you're a Western astrologer and this is a Western chart, you would look at this and you'd say, oh my goodness, look at Mercury. It's in square with Jupiter, Pluto, and Saturn. We know that in astrology, at least the way the Western astrologers would describe it, squares are challenges. Squares are those things that kind of put the heat on, the pressure on. They need a way to release, to express, but not without, kind of blowing things up before they do. And especially with Saturn and Pluto, we've been talking about these guys for, the beginning of the presentation. We know Saturn is restrictive, limiting, demanding. We know that Pluto is transformative, and it just does these weird, huge, big things. And together, square with Mercury, which is the planet of communication, we're going to have some bottleneck kinds of issues on election day. So how's that gonna look? I don't know. We'll have to tune in and see, but expect and I think we have some inkling that, you know, there'll be some other kinds of, there'll be some, you know, like some problems. And it's interesting, though. I just saw today that mail-in ballots so far have reached, what, like 21 million or something like that, or 12 million? I get the numbers reversed. But it's a huge amount of people who are voting right now. So that's pretty cool. So anyway, we can expect some serious communication problems of some sort or another on election day. Mercury in challenging square with Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto. It's in harmonious trine with North Node and the Moon, which might mean there'll be some kind of way out of it, some sort of resolution. Also, there's Neptune challenging the North Node and the Moon. Neptune, it can be, if you look at the, you know, if we take the kind of dire or negative view of Neptune, it can also be illusion and delay. And especially with regard to the Moon, which is generally referred to as the public. So we can see here, there's the North Node. It looks like a horseshoe with the Moon, 20 degrees. This is late at night. And that is square Neptune. So squares are you know, kind of like, yeah, we got to work something out here. And who knows how that's going to look. Okay, let's look at it from a Vedic perspective. And here what I'm doing is I'm looking at it from the U.S. constitutional chart. Whoa. So I'll just read all this. So basically, we're in a Sun Rahu period, which I mentioned. Rahu scrambles things up. Rahu, you know, just, you know, isn't fun to play with sometimes. The con is that the Sun Rahu is in a, we have the Sun Rahu, it's a challenging main and sub-period time. And that goes all the way to August. We talked about that when we talked about the end or the relief to COVID. Rahu, Ketu, and the Moon are in transit over natal Rahu and Ketu. And usually when that happens, you know, things get flipped upside down. What will that mean for the election? I'll leave that up to you. Saturn will be transiting in a challenging way to natal Mercury. Usually when Saturn and Mercury are involved in a challenging way, that means, as we mentioned, even in the Western chart, there's going to be some sort of communication issue. Saturn just kind of takes things and it puts like a doorstop in front of it. Mercury wants to get the word out. Saturn wants to shut it up. What could that be? And then there's a Mars. We've seen Mars in action before. And it's transiting in a challenging way to the 7th, 10th, 1st, and 2nd houses of the U.S. Constitution. And so the public, the president, which is represented by the 10th house. The 1st house is representative of the country itself. The 2nd house is its wealth. Those, or its status, are all going to be affected in some way as a result of this election. I guess if you were to look on the bright side of things, the pro is that there are no transiting planets in the challenging or Dusthana houses, which means no planets in the 6th, 8th, or 12th. Let me talk about the first one in just a minute. Now, let me talk about it now because the whole thing has to do with the sun. Today, the sun went into Libra in the sidereal zodiac, which is the zodiac that is used by Vedic astrologers. It is assumed when the sun goes into Libra, it's going into its detriment or its debilitation. In other words, it does not do well. The sun represents leadership, authority, and government. And every year it goes into its sign of debilitation, Libra, from mid-October to mid-November. It's no wonder the U.S. has problems at election time. So at some point, we should change when we elect our next officials into government. And that ideally would be when the sun is in its own sign, Leo, between mid-August to mid-September, or in its exalted sign of Aries from mid-April to mid-May. But not now. And it's been doing this, I think, since 1845. They wanted time for the farmers to kind of finish up their crops and come back and be able to vote. But boy, have we been having a screwed up time electing our leadership during this time when the sun is in Libra. So that's just a side note about that, but I think it's a very important note. Okay, let's talk about individuals involved here. Here's Donald Trump's Western chart. He was born June 14th, 1946, 10:54 a.m., Jamaica, New York. So as I mentioned, there are people who kind of say, I don't know if that's right, you know, and I've seen all different kinds of other times represented for Donald, but we're going to stick with this. We can see Mars is close to the first house cusp. Mars makes the person somewhat aggressive. Okay. But he was also born during a full moon eclipse. There's the sun, there's the north node opposite, there's the moon, and there's the south node. When you're born in an eclipse, that tends to produce some pretty interesting behavior, to say the least. Now, let's look at Donald Trump on the day of the elections. And here what we have is a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, I could go through all of this, but I think one of the things to mention here is we have, there's a transiting Venus square Mercury. So what we have on the outside are the transiting planets, and what we have on the inside are Donald's natal planets. And so we have a Venus square Mercury, which is unpleasurable communication. We have the north node opposite the moon. The moon and the north and the nodes are kind of like lined up right over his natal stuff. So there's going to be an eclipse of his mind and his emotions at that time. We're going to see Mercury sextile Mars, which is kind of like, you know, there's some energy in his speech at that time. We're going to see some unexpected challenges to dreams because Neptune is square Uranus. And the nodes, of course, as I mentioned, are kind of like, you know, on top of where they were when he was born. And whenever that happens, when the nodes come back to their original position, or in this case, it's actually, back to its original position, then what we have here is some sort of change, like a new chapter in life. Okay. Now here's Joe Biden. As I mentioned, there is no known birth time for Joe. So I took the events in his life and I lined them up against his chart. And I came up with 7:01 a.m. There's information out there that suggests he might be born at 8:30 a.m., but that's kind of like speculative. And so we do know he was born in the morning because there was a newspaper report that came out that said that his parents gave birth to a new kid in the morning. And so here we have November 20th, 1942, 7:01 is what I came up with for Joe Biden. Similarly to Mr. Trump, we have Mars on the ascendant. And Mars kind of gives this passion, this kind of, fiery nature, which Joe has. It's somewhat muted underneath that exterior of his. Here in the Western chart, we see Scorpio rising. Scorpio kind of tends to keep things like underneath. But we also have Mercury, Sun, and Venus in the first house. People say that for the most part he's congenial, easy to get along with, and he's a team player. So on election day, November 3rd, if we were to put the transiting planets then over his natal planets, we see that there's several things happening here. We see that Jupiter is, and I won't point them out, but trust me, Jupiter is sextile Mercury. Jupiter usually means good news. Mercury is news. Jupiter is good news. So you're going to get some good news. Mercury is sextile the midheaven. Midheaven represents our social status, where we want to be in life, our public kind of sphere. And Mercury is shedding a good aspect to his public persona. The Sun is conjunct Mars. You can see that over here. Sun over Mars, which means he's going to be animated. He's going to be excited. He's going to be, fired up about something. Sun is leadership. Mars is the commander-in-chief. Maybe they'll come together on that day. Saturn is sextile the Sun. Saturn is responsibility. Sextile is easy kind of relationship aspect. And so when that's in relationship to the Sun, then we know that we're going to have something that is like a ease of expression between his self and responsibility. That's how we look at that. Now we look at the Vedic sign. And the Vedic chart for Donald Trump is here noted in the North Indian chart style. And I'm just going to point out the fact that he has a strong Jupiter. That in green is Jupiter in the second house of status and wealth. And we all know, he enjoys a certain amount of status and wealth, right? And then we have Mercury over here in hopes, desires, wishes, and earnings. And Mercury is in the 11th house of desire. But what makes him such a difficult communicator is the fact that his third house, which is over here, ruled by Venus. That's the seventh sign of the zodiac, which is Libra. The ruler of Libra is Venus. Venus is over here in the Dustan house of the 12th. And whenever any planet goes over here, or over here, down here, or over here, that means it's going to have some difficulty. There's going to be some challenges. So communication and initiatives are going to be challenged somewhat in his life. This is just in general. We haven't gotten to what his chart looks like on November 3rd yet. Saturn, likewise. Saturn is his ruler of the 7th house. That's the 11th sign of the zodiac right there, which stands for Aquarius. The ruler in traditional astrology, like if you don't count the modern planets, and Vedic astrology doesn't use anything beyond Saturn because they couldn't see it. They didn't have telescopes back in those days. And so Saturn And the seventh house will represent spouses and marital relationships and relationships with other people. That's also in the 12th house. The 12th house means that there'll be challenges with relationships. I think he's on his second marriage. And the 12th house also represents foreign relationships. I think his second wife is from another country. All right, so what's he look like on election day? Whoa! There's a lot of stuff going on here, but I think the main thing we've alluded to earlier is the fact that Rahu and Ketu, those points that create eclipses, are basically eclipsing his natal points. They're coming back to where they were. Actually, they've already come back. The lunar nodes always go in retrograde motion. They're always going backwards. And so you see here on the transit side that they're 26, over here on his natal side they're 27. So they've already hit and they're going backwards. And I think that explains why he was in the hospital in the beginning of the month. But they still could have an effect, because I think they're still in range. And the moon will be transiting in that eclipse point on November 3rd. Not only that, but Saturn is transiting, his Saturn is actually transiting the point of the 6th house, and his Mars is traveling through the 8th house. And he's actually running right now. I can't see that too well. It's on the top of the screen. January 7th, 2019 to July 21st of 2021. So he's in a Saturn subperiod. So when we look at charts and we look at the Mahadasha system, we're looking at what's happening primarily in this case with Saturn, because it moves more quickly and it has a more tangible, immediate effect on our lives. And we see that Saturn's not in a good place. It's in the 6th house of conflict, disputes, and so this could cause some issues around the election time. Mars, as I mentioned, is in his 8th house. 8th house is obstacles and delays. Mars is the ruler of his 9th house, which is his dharma, his path. It's his good fortune house. 9th house is your good fortune house. And the ruler of that, so you see 1 there on the 9th house cusp. 1 stands for Aries. The ruler of Aries traditionally is Mars. Mars here. Mars is not doing so well. So, and then transit Saturn is on the pro side of things, positively aspecting its own natal position and Venus. You can see it kind of like coming over here. But it's doing it from a weak position, so I'm not sure how much support it can really give. So even if we go back to Joe Biden's chart, well, let's see, I think that's, let's do this first. This is something that I put together, and I call it visual Vedic astrology. It kind of like puts everything on a graph. And I've got 2 lines here, one representing the election, November 3rd, the other one representing the inauguration on the 20th. And so what we see here is how everything comes together for Donald. If there are results around election day, I mean, I don't know. It doesn't look too exciting. I mean, goes up a little bit, goes down a little bit. I mean, we all do this. We'll all, if we were to do this for our charts, we'd see we have ups and downs too. This is a big down. It's a downer for everybody, actually. Around the 11th or 12th is when Mercury, the planet of communication of all things, comes into alignment with the lunar nodes, Rahu and Ketu. Boom. That's what that represents right there. But boy, he takes a big upward swing after that later in December. But then around Inauguration Day, it's like, I don't know. All right, so let's talk about Joe Biden. Here his North Indian chart. And we'll just, a word about something here. I mean, he's had tragedies in his life, right? And if you look at the North Node, it's represented by Rahu here. In Vedic astrology, Rahu and Ketu throw aspects to their own place, to their 7th place, and to their 9th place. So I'm going to count 9 places away from Rahu. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Notice that Rahu is 7 degrees 5 minutes. Moon is 7 degrees 8 minutes. I believe that Rahu trine the moon, it's actually a trine position, but it's not considered fortunate in Vedic astrology. Basically, a trine is going to make easy anything that flows through the pipeline of the trine. And if it's Rahu, it's not going to be good. So it's making easy all those not so good and challenging things to the moon. The moon represents, among other things, women. He's lost several women in his life. And the moon represents hopes and desires. So in his natal chart, he's had some problems there. But he's also had some good stuff. You see Mars is pretty close to the ascendant. Mars is favorable in this particular chart. I practice Vedic astrology that assigns goodness and not so goodness to the planets depending on your rising sign. So Saturn is not going to be the bad guy for everybody. Mars is not going to be the bad guy for everybody. It all depends on what your rising sign is. So let's see what's happening with Joe on the election day, November 3rd. Well, we've got something that's happening for everybody, this eclipse of the moon, basically, with Rahu and Ketu. I mean, this is, again, later in the evening. And we have the not-so-good placement of Mars and the not-so-good placement of Venus, which is actually his ruling planet. In Vedic astrology, his rising sign is Libra. And as we can see, his current sign, or his current period, is Jupiter Rahu, which runs until 2023. Rahu is not very nice. So that means that, you know, during this time, he's going to have some ups and downs. Rahu can lift you up to, you know, the heights, and it can bring you down just as quickly. So Rahu has that kind of capability of, you know, just, you know, kind of exposing you to the world in all its glory and in all its infamy. So what can we make of this? Actually, as I mentioned, Saturn in his chart is a good guy, and it's making a relatively good aspect to Jupiter in his natal chart. And so this all is happening in his 10th house. This is the 10th house that I'm circling right here. The 10th house is, you know, your status, your profession, your, you know, your rise to, in people's eyes, to the heights. And Saturn and Jupiter there ain't too bad. And then we've got Sun and Mars. We talked about that a little earlier as kind of giving him a little something to ignite him. Sun is coming to conjunction with his natal Mars. So maybe there is something good, but there's something not so good too. So does that mean that there'll be something with the election day that means that there'll be a delay in terms of what happens? Will the results be announced right away? I don't know, but it looks like Joe might hold out some hope here, if not have the hope. Let's take a look at his visual Vedic astrology forecast. Looks a little bit better than Trump's, actually. He's way up here on election day. And if you look at inauguration day, he's on the rise there. He also experiences that dip that we all will when Mercury is eclipsed by the nodes here on the 11th, 12th of December. And just for fun, I threw in Kamala Harris. I don't have Michael Pence's date. So, or time. Kamala, same thing, nice, kind of upbeat kind of thing. Down here where everybody else is. And then kind of on the rise for inauguration. Who knows what that means? So, if I were to take all this information, what would I say? It's going to be an interesting day, I think. There'll be some information, misinformation. We've seen how Mercury is affected negatively on that day. And also, I want to mention that Mercury on election day is going to be turning direct. And the last time it did that on election day was back in 2000 when we had George W. Bush versus Al Gore and the hanging chads controversy in Florida. Wow. When any planet goes direct or when it goes retrograde, it's kind of like in this stationary period and its energy intensifies. And so we're going to see some intensified energy on election day, I think. What that will result in, we'll see. But here's Kamala Harris, and, she's looking pretty positive for the most part. We're all going to go through this. So I would say maybe, I'm going to put myself out there. Like I said, I'm going to put myself on a limb. Maybe the planets here are favoring the Biden-Harris ticket. Maybe. That is, if I've got the U.S. Constitution chart right, that is, if I've got Biden's chart right, given that, then maybe there could be a swing in that direction. But then maybe there could be some sort of upheaval regarding the election itself. We've seen how this year has been a series of ups and downs, so we can expect the unexpected on election day. So the last thing I'm going to talk about in this presentation is the 20-year election cycle. You may have heard of it. It's called Tecumseh's Curse. And basically, this is how it goes. It's also called the Curse of Tippecanoe. So Tecumseh was a Shawnee chief, and back in the early 1800s, William Harrison was the governor of the Indiana Territory. And they got into it. They kind of, scrambled it up with some fights. Harrison did some wily things that took land away from Native America. So the loss of Native American land and losses at the battles of Tippecanoe and the Thames resulted, and, Tecumseh just had enough, so his brother, known by the Shawnee as the Prophet, placed a curse of death on all future U.S. presidents elected in the years, ending in a 0. And it began with William Henry Harrison back in 1840 when he was elected. And in 1841, he passed in office from pneumonia. We all know about Abraham Lincoln in 1860, who was elected. In 1880, James Garfield from an assassination. 1900, William McKinley from an assassination. Warren Harding from a heart attack in office. Franklin Roosevelt, cerebral hemorrhage. Kennedy, assassination. The curse seemed to have been broken in 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected. He was shot, but he survived. George Bush as well in 2000. However, we must not forget that UA Flight 93 during the 2001 11/11 attacks that flight was designated to go toward Washington, D.C., presumably the White House, which George wasn't in at the time. And then there was an assassination attempt in the country of Georgia in 2005 on George W. Bush. It was a hand grenade tossed at him, but there was a bandana kind of tightly strung around the grenade, which didn't set off. So whoever is elected in 2020, I don't know. I'm just saying there seems to be this thing out there. Is it broken? I don't know. Seems that many of these happened during the conjunction of Jupiter. Well, actually, they all happened during the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. So every 20 years, Jupiter and Saturn get together. And when they do, they set off this Tecumseh's curse. And those presidents that have been affected earlier were in Earth signs, just like they are now. And we're talking about the Western Astrology Zodiac. So we're talking about Jupiter and Saturn in Capricorn. Capricorn is an Earth sign. And I think Reagan and Bush, I don't know if they were earth or air. They were a different, maybe, element altogether. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. Okay. So I'm going to conclude this with some closing thoughts. I think astrology reflects our natural laws and the ever-balancing of the yin and the yang of life. Where there is imbalance, there are corrections. Certainly, we've seen population corrections. We've seen, mass, people, dying of illnesses and so forth. Maybe that's to whittle down the population. We've seen economy corrections through the stock market. We've seen ecology corrections. When we have forest fires, of course, what is that all about? That's because we are kind of rebalancing the growth of our natural resources and justice imbalances. And I think that's what we're seeing in this year is a lot of corrections. And hopefully if we stick together and be supportive of one another, we can get through this. And I'd like to thank you. I appreciate your considerate presence and our time together this evening, and I hope this has been helpful in some way to you, and I'm ready for any comments or questions.
There are several comments and questions in the chat list.
Okay.
Would you like me to read them, or would you like to read them?
All right, let me take a look. So Aga, hi Aga. She said in 1982 there was a military coup in Poland. So that was one of the major changes from the last Saturn-Pluto conjunction. Thank you for bringing that out, Aga. Good to hear from you again. Scott Silverman says, what lines do you have in Boulder, Indiana, Kirkland, Ground Zero? That's a good question. I haven't calculated those out, Scott, but be happy to take a look at those a little more closely for you. And Scott also said, you chose New Hampshire rather than Washington, D.C. or Philadelphia, PA. That's because the ratification of the U.S. Constitution happened in Concord, New Hampshire. And so that's the birth of that chart right there, which is different, I know, than a lot of people who will say that it's Philadelphia or maybe even Washington. So thank you for that question. Scott also asks, there's another time Bill Meridian, who's a good astrologer, uses the time comes from Marla Maples and Trump's mother for Trump's chart. Do you know what time that was by any chance? 9:51, he says on the next comment. 9:51 is the alternate time for Donald Trump, but I'm relying on memory. It would be fun if you tried this time out, Shayn. I'll double check it. Yeah, please, Scott, and then let me know what you came up with. Again, I'm sticking to the 10:54 a.m. simply because my teacher used that to make his prediction that was successful. So good. Whitney, rebirth. If you could elaborate on that a little bit, Whitney, that'd be great. Certainly we're experiencing the rebirth. When we talk about Pluto, we're talking about rebirth. It's a planet that, kind of takes everything. It's huge, transformational, deep, rebirthing kinds of changes. That's definitely the Pluto message right there. Scott talks about third, and I'm not quite sure what that means. Moon, Rahu, disturbed psychology. Basically when the moon and Rahu come together, Rahu, has this insatiable greed and this thirst to acquire and to, get more material stuff. And the moon is our intellectual and emotional center. You'll find that, maybe, in Jyotish anyway, in Vedic astrology, the moon is both represented by the mind and the emotion. And so when you get Rahu kind of stirring up the emotions and the mind, you get kind of this restlessness that, just can't stand still. And so, I'd say in some sense that is disturbed psychology. Thanks for that comment, Scott. Appreciate that. Yuchi, good to hear from you, Yuchi. Hi, thanks for joining us. 12/8. December 8th, 2020 is the deadline for resolving election disputes. Oh, interesting. And 12/14, she said, is the meeting of the Electoral College. Ooh, so it's not over until it's over, right? I mean, yeah, if this thing were to go on, certainly there's more to look at, yeah. Scott says, thank you for an interesting presentation with an illuminating mix of Western and Eastern. Much food for thought. Good, thanks. I'm glad you appreciated that. And Marilyn, good to hear from you. She was among one of the healers in that group that I talked with last year. Thank you very much. You're so welcome, Marilyn. Glad you could join us today. Patty says, thank you. Very interesting. Thank you very much, Patty. Appreciate that. Jenny, and she was part of that group too. Thank you, Jenny. I appreciate your comments too. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Let's see, Scott, different remarks at different times. Thank you. Okay. Whitney, about Trump, on election day, that was my first thought as you starting to explain the eclipse on his natal chart for election day. Yeah, that really is disturbing, isn't it? I mean, when you get an eclipse right on your chart on the day that you are, awaiting the results of, the vote. That could be interesting. Scott says third met Melania's with Trump's third marriage. Oh, he's been married 3 times now, huh? Well, yeah, and so that planetary influence that I mentioned on Trump's seventh house. Seventh house represents partnerships. Yeah, of course, that's going to affect how many marriages you run through. Rebirth, I mean, yeah. So, yeah, thank you all for your comments, and really appreciate those. And I'd like to invite you, if you would like to, coming up next year in February, I'm going to be teaching a class through the Boulder Lifelong Learning. It's called Learn Astrology, and it's going to be more on the Western side of things, where I talk about, what Western astrologies normally talk about, the planets, the signs, the moon's nodes, a little different kind of take than maybe Vedic astrology, and how to synthesize all this information so that you can come up with a coherent interpretation. It's going to be offered online beginning 5 weeks on February 2nd to March 2nd for 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. It's not up there yet on their website. So if you want to contact me, I'll be happy to let you know when that's coming up, in case you'd like to learn more about this fascinating science. I call it a science because we're actually using, planetary motions and planets and, aspects and all sorts of things to make an interpretation of what it all means. As above, so below. So let's connect. You can reach me at shaynastrology.com. That's my website. Email shane@shaynastrology.com. My phone number is 720-988-7319. Would certainly love to hear from you. Please let me know your thoughts, and let me know if there's any way I can answer your questions or help you out. And that's the show for tonight, folks. Thank you again, Gloria, for inviting me to present, and it's been a thrill. It really has.